Okay, so we're here back, part 2 now, where we're going to talk about the Phillips curve and the development of the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis. Okay, this diagram that I've added to the board, you still see the 45-degree diagram here. I should actually make sure that you can see all of that diagram. So, this is our 45-degree diagram, which we went over in part 1. This is known as the Phillips curve. Okay? And this is where we're going to get our vertical supply curve from. Okay? And how the textbook Keynesians became the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis. Okay? This diagram is how they stopped really embodying what Keynes said. Okay? So, in our 45-degree diagram in part 1, I said our first level of aggregate expenditure, AE1, is equal to consumption plus investment. Okay? And this consumption plus investment, AE1, may intersect the 45-degree line at this point. Okay? Is it full employment? Well, maybe it could be, but here I've shown it not to be because it most likely will not be full employment. Okay? As long as there's savings, you won't really have full employment. Okay? Remember, savings don't make cash registers go off. So, if you have consumption and investment, right, that forms AE1, that produces a level of income that I've labeled as Y star. Okay, it's just our equilibrium level of income. And is that the full employment level? Well, no, I labeled it as not the full employment level. Okay, I labeled it that because more often than not, it's not going to be full employment. Okay, so what I then said is the textbook Keynesians proposed, well, if the aggregate level of expenditure falls short of full employment, then you can add the government into AE1. Okay? So in AE1, you just had consumption and investment. Okay? Well, now you could add in AE2. Right? We could raise the level of expenditure to AE2 by having consumption and investment, and then the government could spend, right? Allow the government to intervene in the economy. And when they intervene in the economy, their increased level of spending could raise the economy from this point, from point, 1 to point 2. Okay, you could go from 1 to 2, which would allow the total level of spending, right? It crosses the 45-degree line at different points, right? Across the 45-degree line at different points. I think I was out of the frame there, so I'm going to stand over here. At 1 and 2, the total level of spending crosses the 45-degree line at different points, which means now we've gotten to full employment. Okay? So a lot of this I mentioned sounds like Keynes, right? Aggregate expenditure seems to be determining the level of income and employment. Sounds like Keynes, even though they treat investment differently, completely separately, it still seems like the aggregate level of expenditure is determining income and employment. Okay, so far so good. Now, the rub is when neoclassical Keynesian economists introduced inflation, okay? And when they created the Phillips curve. I mentioned in the 70s, right, there were 2 oil shocks in this country. OPEC was formed, and OPEC raised the price of oil on Americans. So what you ended up getting was a lot of people worrying about inflation. At the same time, right? Because if the price of oil goes up, then prices go up, which means inflation happens. So you saw a shift in macroeconomics. Keynes invented macroeconomics to talk about employment. In the 60s and 70s, you saw people starting to worry about inflation, okay? Now, in reality, lots of studies have shown that economic activity really is not affected until there's at least 20% inflation, okay? 18 to 25% inflation. That's when economic activity, quantities, employment, things like that, are actually impacted. Before 18 to 25%, inflation doesn't really have an impact on the economy, okay? So, to a large degree, in my opinion, this emphasis, this worriment, that still persists to this day, okay, amongst economists, policymakers, and the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is obsessed with inflation, okay? A lot of it is misplaced, okay? This country hasn't really had huge bouts with inflation in 30 years, okay, since the 70s. That happened before I was even born. And we haven't had inflation problems for a while, okay? Even then, the inflation in the 70s wasn't caused by any Keynesian mechanisms, okay? Keynes and his economics fell out of favor, no longer became popular in the 70s, because everyone said, look, it causes inflation. Well, Keynes's ideas didn't cause inflation. What caused inflation was a bunch of the oil-producing nations getting together and saying, hey, let's make more money off of oil, right? That's a far cry from spend more to raise employment, right? One's collusion, one is simply expenditure, okay? Regardless, we come to the Phillips curve, okay? And like I said, the Phillips curve is what takes the textbook Keynesian model and completely removes it from Keynes, okay? The Phillips curve is what makes this become very, very neoclassical, okay? So, and introduces a self-adjusting mechanism once again. The Phillips curve says that there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, okay? The lower unemployment goes, okay, so the lower you get unemployment, the more people have jobs, the lower unemployment goes, then the higher inflation will go. Okay? That's what this is saying. That's what this curved line is. As unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. Okay? So as unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. On the other hand, if you want to have low inflation, you have to have high unemployment. Okay? Now remember, the neoclassicals said that the aggregate supply curve is vertical. Let's say that we're at point A. Okay? Oh, and I labeled the curve as PC1. That's Phillips curve 1. Okay? So let's say we're at point A, which corresponds, I guess I can make this point A. Okay? I just transitioned 1 and 2 to A and B, so the points correspond. Okay? Let's say we're at point A. There's a lot of unemployment here. Okay? There's a lot of unemployment. We're very far to the right. If this is 0, this is 20, right? We have 20% unemployment. Same thing here. There's quite a large distance between full employment and the current level of employment. Okay? So, what can we do? Well, the textbook Keynesians said you can add government spending to just consumption and investment. Okay, so if you add government spending to consumption and investment, you go from AE1 to AE2, or you go from point A to point B. Okay? What that does is it'll cause you to go from Y star to full employment. Okay? So let's see, A to B. Well, that has caused unemployment to go way down. Okay? But it also will cause prices to go up. At least that's what people believed. Why did they believe that? Because they were still using a neoclassical supply curve. I'm just drawing this very small because we're going to make a quick point, but if you have a vertical neoclassical supply curve, okay, and you have this level of demand, that will be your price level, okay, which P0. Okay, you'll have that price level. But if you increase demand, which we're doing here, we're going from AE1 to AE2. If you increase demand and you believe in a vertical supply curve, then you'll simply get higher prices. Okay? So the textbook Keynesians said, well, if you introduce government spending, you can go from point A to point B. Right? If the government spends more, you go from A to B, which means you can go from a situation of unemployment to full employment. Okay? You can go from Y star to YF. But, and in this Phillips curve, that's what you're saying. Going from A to B will lower unemployment. You'll go from here to here. Unemployment will go down. But if you decide to go ahead and spend more, be careful, because prices will also go up. Why did they think prices were going to go up? They still had this idea in the back of their heads, whether they realized it or didn't, they still had this idea in the back of their heads of a vertical supply curve, okay? They hadn't really broke free from the neoclassical model yet, okay? So, where are we? I was just trying to explain the relationship between these two diagrams. Point A, we have unemployment. Point B, we have full employment. Okay. Point A, we have unemployment. Point B, we're more or less at full employment, but there's inflation. Prices are rising. Okay? So when you go from point A to point B, sure, unemployment can go down, which is a good thing, but prices could go up, which is a bad thing, okay? At least we think it's a bad thing. So, once that happens, once these prices go up, well, if you were a worker, right, and you saw prices going up, what are you going to ask your boss for? You're going to ask your boss for a higher wage, right? I got to buy more gas, I have to pay more tolls, the price of bread, milk, eggs, right, all this stuff. It's going up. Well, if prices are going up, then I need to get more dollars per hour, right? Maybe you make $10 an hour, you walk in, you ask your boss for $15 an hour, okay? So that's great, right? You go in, you ask your boss for more money. Well, it may work out for you, but it might not work out for everyone. Remember, we're basically at full employment here. The same way we're basically at full employment here. At point B, right, at these 2 points, point B, they're identical, at point B, we're basically at full employment. So if everyone asks their boss for a raise, what ends up happening is some businesses have to fire some of their workers, right? Because they can't pay everyone more money, okay? Everyone asks for a raise, some people are going to get fired because your labor costs can't go up that much, okay? At least that's what a lot of people thought. Research has shown that it may not actually work out that way, but we're going to leave that to the side, okay? If everyone asks for a raise, well then some people are going to get fired. So, to work through the whole story again, we're at point A with a lot of unemployment. We raise the level of spending from A1 to A2 by introducing the government. That gets us from point A to point B. We go from this level of income and employment to this level of income and employment, to full employment. Okay? From A to B, we had a lot of unemployment, now we have very little, but prices went up. Okay? We went from A to B. Once that happened, now everyone walked into their boss's office, asked them for a raise, right? Because you say, hey, prices are going up, I need more money. What that does is it causes some people to be fired, okay? So even though prices are now still the same, you have unemployment going up again. So prices are the same, but you have more people being fired. Okay. I'm going to label this as point B apostrophe or B prime. Okay? And I actually should probably get it out of the way there. So what ends up happening is your PC1 actually shifts outwards. Okay? You get a new Phillips curve, PC2. Okay? Remember, prices are the same, right? Increased government spending pushes up prices, at least that's what we think. Increased government spending pushed up prices, although we did get to full employment. Increased government spending lowered unemployment, right? It took us from A to B, so we lowered unemployment, but we pushed up prices, which caused us to go from A to B. At B, once we were at B, everyone walks into their boss's office, hey, can I get a raise? No, I can't afford all of that. Some of you are going to have to be fired, okay? So even though prices are still very high, right? This was our initial level of prices. This is our new level of prices. So prices have gone up, and now that prices are still pretty high, if everyone asks for a raise, the boss has to fire some people. Which means that even though prices are still at P1, unemployment now goes from B to B prime. Okay? Maybe some of you can already see where we're going with this. No matter what level of prices, there's always going to be, the conclusion you reach, at least in the Phillips curve discussion, is that if you try to lower unemployment, what that will do is push up prices. Okay? And when that happens, once prices go up, the people who went from being unemployed to employed, they're the ones who pushed the prices up, which caused some other people to get fired. Okay? So, the result of this is, let's connect the dots. The result is a vertical, again, the result is a vertical aggregate supply curve. Okay? No matter what the price, there's always some group of people that need to be unemployed. If you try to push unemployment down, prices will go up. Once prices go up, those people who got jobs, they're actually going to get fired again. Okay? So in order to prevent rising prices, you need to have some group of people who are always unemployed. Okay? That's what the Phillips curve is saying. This is unemployment. I use the Greek letter mu to represent unemployment. Okay? This is the amount of people who are unemployed. So no matter what the price level, this is the quantity of unemployment. It's an aggregate supply curve because, if you think about it, right, if you have 10 people, and no matter what the price, and you leave one of them unemployed, right, so this would be one person. You leave one of them unemployed, the other 9 are still making as much as they possibly can, regardless of the price level. Okay? So now we see the return of the vertical supply curve. This is neoclassical, right? It's a vertical supply curve. So the conclusion, we're going to talk about the relationship between this and this. Okay? The general idea that we started with was that you could go from point A, where there is unemployment, to point B, where there is full employment. However, in the Phillips curve, I'm just going to draw it dotted so you can really focus on the vertical one. So we went from point A to point B. Okay? Same way here we went from point A to point B. What ended up happening, once we went from point A to point B, right, the government spent, we went from unemployment to full employment. The same way we go from A to B, right? We were adding jobs to the economy. Unemployment was going down. Once we did that, however, we said prices are probably going to go up. And once prices go up, workers are going to ask for a higher wage. If workers ask for a higher wage, then some workers are going to be fired, right? Because not everyone can make more money. What that's going to do is cause the economy to have a new Phillips curve with point B prime. Okay? So we're right back at the same old level of unemployment, right? We started with A, now we're at B prime. It's the same level of unemployment, but prices went from here to here. Okay? So unemployment has actually, inflation has actually risen. Okay? So essentially the conclusion that we reached was, sure, the government can get involved and make the economy go from A to B. Okay? The government can get involved, raise the level of aggregate expenditure, and cause the economy to go from unemployment to full employment. But the cost of going from here to here, or from A to B, is going to be that all those people who got hired, they're going to end up raising prices. Once those prices are raised, everyone asks for a higher wage, and some people are going to get fired again. Okay? So this government, right? The government trying to help people out by lowering unemployment, well, actually what all they end up doing is raising prices. Okay? That was the idea. Okay? So you end up having the same level of unemployment, right? A and B prime. It's the same level of unemployment, but with higher prices. So the same amount of people are still unemployed, but the rest of us are all still worse off because prices have now gone up. So what's the solution? Well, the government, trying to be good, trying to help people out, right? To go from A1 to A2, right? Where you would have, you go from unemployment to full employment. The government was trying to help people out, but instead, it actually didn't work out. It backfired, okay? Because all you ended up doing was producing higher inflation, okay? Now, so what's the best idea? What's the best policy? Well, create a welfare state, food stamps, unemployment insurance, things like that. Where, sure, you're unemployed, but we're not going to make you starve to death, right? We'll give you handouts here and there to help you get along, okay? That's where this led to, okay? And the creation of the modern welfare state in America by Lyndon B. Johnson. This is the economic theory that was behind it, okay? Lyndon Johnson called it the War on Poverty. It just celebrated its 50th year in existence, right? Its 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. America has not done well in the War on Poverty at all, okay? All you need to do is Google poverty rate, and you'll see that there's been really zero impact in this country. Why? Because we believe that we have to have some optimal, and we actually call it the optimal level of unemployment to avoid having prices go up, okay? So what should we do? Even though the government could step in, right? Even though textbook Keynesian said the government can step in and get us from unemployment to full employment, they ultimately came to the conclusion that the government shouldn't get too involved because all that's going to do is cause prices to go up. So yeah, it stinks, right? You know, some people have to be unemployed, but it's better that a few suffer with no inflation, right? It's better to have a few unemployed with no inflation than to have the same number unemployed, right? It's better to have a few unemployed, A, with very little inflation, than the same number unemployed with higher prices for all, right? It's better to be at A than at B prime, okay? So therefore, while the government could fix things if they'd spend, that's going to end up ultimately hurting everyone because we're just going to have higher prices, okay? So this became the backdrop. This is the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, okay? It's what you call the textbook Keynesians, the bastard Keynesians, the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, and it has been the economic theory for every president since at least the mid-1970s, probably earlier. Yeah, it's been since at least Lyndon B. Johnson, okay? Whether it is George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan. Every single one of them believe this. Okay? This is the theory that is currently running America, and our next president, whether that's going to be Hillary or who, well, let's be honest, it's going to be Hillary, because the Republicans probably don't have a very good shot of putting up a candidate that could win this election. But if it's a Republican president, he's going to believe this too. Okay? So whether it's Hillary or a Republican, this is the theory that they are going to believe. So when we think in this country that we have a very big choice in our political decisions, right? Are we going to elect a Republican or a Democrat, right? We're going far left or we're going far right, right? We think we have this huge decision to make between two candidates who might be vastly different. And what I've just told you is, this is what George W. Bush and Barack Obama both believe, right? And George W. Bush is typically thought of being pretty far to the right, and Barack Obama is thought of as being pretty far to the left. And my point to you is, well, they both believe the same economic theory, so maybe they're both not that far in either direction, okay? Or maybe there's not that much of a difference between them. They are pretty far in one direction, but I would argue they're both actually pretty right. Okay, so on top of this, on top of the Phillips curve, we now have come to the conclusion that there is a vertical aggregate supply curve in the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, right? The only difference, and I'm going to erase this and draw it up, okay? The only difference is, in the neoclassical theory, there was no unemployment, right? In the neoclassical theory of the 1870s, the labor market always produced full employment. Here, there's some unemployment. Not that much, but some, and it's still a vertical supply curve. That's why I said the Phillips curve was the biggest creation of at least the 1950s to 2000. Okay? It was a very big creation for the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis. The neoclassicals said vertical aggregate supply curve. At the full employment level of output, right? Because the production function produces the full employment level of output, okay? So you ended up having a vertical supply curve, which we talked about in part 1 of this lecture. The difference now between the Phillips curve aggregate supply curve, and the neoclassical aggregate supply curve, so I'll label this as neoclassical, NC, neoclassical aggregate supply curve. The difference is there's just a little bit of unemployment. So they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty darn close. Okay? And this will be PCAS, which is Phillips curve aggregate supply. Okay? So what I've done is the difference between the two, the space between the two, that just represents mu, right? Greek letter mu, mu, which I use to indicate unemployment. Okay? So like I said, with the neoclassical model, right, you have 10 people in a room, and we're all producing the same amount of stuff. Okay? well, we're producing as much stuff as we can, regardless of the price level, right? In the neoclassical model, everyone who's looking for a job can find a job, so the 10 of us all have jobs, and we're producing as much as we possibly can. In the Phillips curve version, maybe one person of the 10 doesn't have a job, right? Because not all of us want to have to deal with inflation. So while one of those people doesn't have a job, the other 9 of us do have jobs, and we are making as much as we can regardless of the level of inflation, regardless of the price level, which is inflation, okay? So, what I'm going to do now is erase the neoclassical aggregate supply curve. I mentioned, and what I'm going to do now, I'm going to try to highlight for you a major difference between Keynes and the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis. Okay? Here, in the Phillips curve aggregate supply curve, okay, we have a situation where if we draw in a demand curve, we would end up with this level of output, okay? And this would be our price level. Well, let's say we increase demand, right? What if demand goes up? Well, we still have the same level of output, but now prices have gone up. Okay? Prices went up. Which means the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis essentially believes demand has no impact on output. Okay? What they're saying with this Phillips curve, right, with the long-run Phillips curve, the vertical supply curve, if demand, right, we increase demand, but we still have the same level of output and employment. So what we're saying here is demand doesn't matter. Okay? What we're saying is that demand does not have any impact on output. And that's what the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis is saying. That is completely different from what John Maynard Keynes said, right? John Maynard Keynes said the more you increase effective demand, okay, the higher you get aggregate demand, what he called effective demand. The higher you get effective demand, the higher income and employment will go. Okay? So therefore, this whole construction, this textbook Keynesian model, whether you want to call it the bastard Keynesians, the textbook Keynesians, or the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, they ended up ultimately saying aggregate demand doesn't matter for determining employment. What did Keynes say? Aggregate demand determines employment. So I started off this lecture by saying the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, or the textbook Keynesians, or the bastard Keynesians, whatever you want to call them. I started off by saying they're actually very neoclassical and not Keynesian at all. Why did I say that? Because they're much more neoclassical, right? They have a vertical supply curve. They have a vertical supply curve, and they say that demand does not determine output or employment. That's a lot closer to the neoclassicals than it is to Keynes. Right? It's vastly different. Okay? So, as a result, what you ended up having was these two schools of thought, right? You had neoclassicals. Again? Come on. You had neoclassicals and you had Keynesians who merged into this one school. But meanwhile, Keynes was sort of left out here on the side and wasn't really incorporated at all into this. Because remember, Keynes says aggregate demand determines level of employment and income. Here, the Phillips curve determines employment and income. Okay? Aggregate demand has no effect. Also, Keynes had a horizontal supply curve. Here, these Keynesians have a vertical supply curve. It doesn't seem Keynesian at all, which is why you had a man named Axel Leyenhofen, okay, in 1980, might have been 83, I'm not sure, around then, he wrote an article saying Keynesian economics versus the economics of Keynes. And what he did was he more or less pointed this out. Okay? He said, look, you have all these guys running around calling themselves Keynesians, right? There's Keynesian economics, and that is completely different from the economics of Keynes. That's why I always like to point this out in my classes as well. I write, there's Keynes, and then there's Keynesian economics. Okay? When guys such as Paul Krugman, Larry Summers, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, when they say that they are Keynesian, Joseph Stiglitz, when they say they are Keynesian, they really have no idea what they're talking about, because they all fit into this category. Okay? They are all, in one form or another, members of the textbook Keynesian, neoclassical Keynesian synthesis school. Okay? They all believe in this, which is very, very different from Keynes. Okay? So you get, these guys claiming, I'm such a Keynesian, etc., and they actually don't really know what they're talking about all that much, because they've left out the role of aggregate demand. Okay? The only way someone could be a true Keynesian, a true Keynes follower, you have to start with admitting the level of spending. Effective demand determines income and output. Okay? That's step one. This diagram does not uphold that statement. Okay? So, now we're going to move on very briefly, and I'm going to go over a PowerPoint that I handed you guys. Handed out to the class. It's on Blackboard. There was one final thing. There was one final development that the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis came up with. Okay? Remember, I also mentioned in part one, Keynes, the neoclassicals, said that there is a self-adjusting mechanism in capitalism. Okay? In other words, the market will self-adjust, and therefore government intervention is not needed. Okay? If there was a shock to the economy, right? If oil prices went up, or if there was unemployment, don't worry about it. Markets will adjust, and you'll end up in a new equilibrium. Keynes said, look, if the level of spending is too low, you're going to have unemployment no matter what. The market won't fix it. And he also said, maybe the market would fix it, but that's going to take the long run. And in the long run, we're all dead. Okay? So, what you end up having are these two schools of thought, right? The neoclassicals said there is a self-adjusting mechanism. Keynes said there is no self-adjusting mechanism. Okay? The final nail in the coffin for Keynes, more or less, right, where he was bastardized, right, where he became a textbook version instead of what he actually said, the last straw, if you will, was the real balance effects. Okay? The real balance effects which I'm going to talk about in the PowerPoints, it's important to get this message through, though. This is the theme of the real balance effects. What they did was Keynesians, right? They're still Phillips curve guys, but they're Keynesian, showed how there could be self-adjusting mechanisms in the economy. Okay? So let me say that again. Neoclassicals said markets self-adjust. Keynes said they don't. Then you have these Keynesians, these textbook Keynesians, merging with the neoclassicals. They call themselves Keynesian, but they're really neoclassicals. And when they're merging with them, they came up with these two effects, the real balance effect, the direct real balance effect, and the indirect real balance effect. And those two effects said that markets are self-correcting. Okay? So guys who were running around saying, I'm a Keynesian, also believed that markets would self-adjust. Okay? So once you had a combination of Keynesians who believed in self-adjusting markets combined with neoclassicals, Keynes really didn't have a shot anymore. Okay? One, he had already passed on. Two, his whole message of markets do not self-correct, right, or fix themselves, self-adjust, his message that there is no self-adjusting mechanism was dead, right? Because Keynesians said, look, there are self-adjusting mechanisms going on, just like the neoclassicals. Then you get the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, and Keynes is sort of left on his own. The only group that followed Keynes from that point forward is what's known as the post-Keynesians. Okay? And I am a member of that school, full disclosure. I believe I follow the post-Keynesians. I believe that I am following what Keynes actually said. Okay? The post-Keynesians have now turned into something called modern money theory, okay, which is what we're going to go over next week. So next week, right now, we're going to talk about the grand neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, and then next week, in the next lecture, we're going to talk about modern money theory, okay? Where are the post-Keynesians at now, right? It goes Keynes, post-Keynesians, modern money theory. Where are they at, okay? So, let's just talk about this self-adjusting mechanism, and then we're going to wrap up the material from week 5, okay? How did the Keynesians go about merging with the neoclassicals to say that there is, in fact, a self-adjusting mechanism in capitalism? The answer is the direct and the indirect real balance effects. You just have to wait for the projector to heat up. Oh, come on. Here we go. Actually, maybe I should turn the light on for that. So, as I mentioned, the real balance effects have two parts. The direct effect, which is called sometimes the Pigou effect, okay? The direct effect is also known as the Pigou effect, and the indirect real balance effect, which is known as the Keynes effect. Now, that may seem a little confusing. I don't mean to confuse you. Keynes never said anything about the indirect real balance effect. That's not Keynes, okay? It was named Keynes because people said that, oh, this is in Keynes's general theory, okay? This is not the substance of the general theory, okay? They just named it after him to say, oh, you know, I found it in the general theory, but it's not the substance of the general theory, okay? In case you're wondering, the Pigou effect was simply Keynes's boss at Cambridge. He was a professor before Keynes, okay? Okay. So, how do we have a self-adjusting mechanism in capitalism? Okay? The Keynesians, right, who are growing closer towards the neoclassicals in this neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, right? We have the 45-degree diagram, we have the Phillips curve, right? And we've put those two together to create a vertical supply curve, just like the neoclassical model. So we have a vertical supply curve, and aggregate demand seems to not matter for determining output and employment. Okay, so that's the model so far. In order for Keynesians to truly become neoclassicals, right? Keynesians so far didn't have any self-adjusting mechanism. Neoclassicals had a self-adjusting mechanism. So if the Keynesians could develop their own, then they would both see eye to eye. They'd say, oh look, there is a self-adjusting mechanism in capitalism. That's great. We don't have any problems. There's a neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, right? So that way, see, that stuff in Keynes, he was really just a neoclassical economist, and it wasn't that general of a general theory, okay? Unlike what he thought. So how do they do it? These real balance effects. The first real balance effect, let's start with unemployment, right? What Keynes cared about so much. Unemployment. Let's say aggregate supply is greater than aggregate demand, okay? Some people start spending less for some reason. We're producing a lot of stuff, but people are spending less. Well, if that happens, then prices will fall, okay? Supply is greater than demand, prices go down, which means the real value of your dollar increases. Okay, what does that mean, the real value of your dollar? Well, currently, hopefully I have a single currently. I don't. Shoot. Let's say that these sunglasses cost $10, and here's a $10 bill. Well, so far, as of right now, it takes one of these to get one of these, okay? However, if supply is greater than demand, prices go down. If prices go down, the real value of the dollar goes up, which means prices go down. Maybe these were 10, but now they're 5. Well, if these become $5, I can, with this piece of paper, I can buy 2 of these, right? It takes, well, $10 used to take one of these to get one pair of these. Now it takes one of these to get 2 of these. So the real value, right? How much real stuff I can purchase with this green piece of paper, how much I can actually purchase, the real stuff, I can buy more things now with the same amount of money. So when prices go down, the real value of the dollar goes up. If people can buy more things, well then consumption and investment goes up, right? If you could suddenly buy more sunglasses, more phones, more iTunes music, whatever, right? Then consumption and investment goes up, okay? Consumption and investment leads to the multiplier. That's the spending multiplier that we talked about in week 3 from Keynes, right, in lecture 3. They kept the multiplier, okay, the spending multiplier. They said, you know what, that Keynes came up with that, and it's the multiplier. See, we are Keynesian. We're following Keynes. We have the multiplier, even though the multiplier is probably the most minuscule of Keynes's contributions, okay? It was a big one, but there were a lot of bigger ones, okay? So consumption and investment goes up, which hits the multiplier, which causes income to go up, and eventually you'll get to full employment, or what we would call the Phillips curve full employment, right? Where everyone has a job except for a small percentage of the economy, okay? So this is the direct effect or the Pigou effect. The names are interchangeable, okay? Supply is greater than demand, prices go down, increases the real value of your money, which causes consumption and investment to go up. When that happens, you end up having income go up and you get back to full employment, okay? So, you have a self-adjusting mechanism, right? The economy is operating at full employment, okay? Phillips curve full employment, but full employment, right? A few people don't have jobs, but most people have jobs, okay? We're at full employment, and then suddenly, boom, let's say there's some unemployment that develops, some more unemployment. Well, if that happens, it's going to push prices down, which increases the real value of your money. Consumption and investment go up, which causes the economy to start heading back to full employment. So these Keynesians, right, people who are Keynesians, right, the textbook Keynesians, that's who we're actually talking about. The textbook Keynesians now had a self-adjusting mechanism which complemented the neoclassicals, okay? So now you really have a neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, okay? There's one more, the Keynes effect, or the indirect real balance effect. And this is where you finally started getting, this is ultimately where Keynes's influence sort of came to an end, okay? And he was just left with the post-Keynesians following him, okay? His run came to an end when they put his name on an effect, on the Keynes effect, okay? In order to talk about the Keynes effect, we need to go through one thing first, which is the demand for money. We need to talk about money demand, okay? Money demand is essentially how much of your paycheck, for example, it's how much of your income do you want to turn into money, okay? How much do you want to convert into money? So let's say you had a summer job. Let's just keep it easy. When you were a teenager, right? You got a paycheck. Let's say it was for $500, okay? You always brought that to the bank, okay? When you brought it to the bank, essentially how much did you turn into money or cash, okay? Or did you go off and buy bonds with it or something like that, which is unrealistic for a 16-year-old, but I think you're getting the point. It's how much of your income do you want to turn into money, okay? Or other close assets, right? Such as a savings account or a checking account, okay? That's what your money demand is. Keynes said there are 3 motives for money demand, okay? There's 3 reasons why you would want to convert your income into money, which is 2 different things. Income is what you get for working, okay? You can decide to keep your income, you can turn it into stocks and bonds, or, like most of us, you can turn it into cash, money, okay? Keynes said there's 3 reasons for turning your income into money. There's 3 money demands, okay? There's the transaction motive, the transaction demand, the precautionary demand, and the speculative demand. Okay? The transactions demand, okay, it's just you want to keep cash on hand, right? Maybe you're going to buy water bottles, some pizza, whatever, right? It's the amount of cash, the amount of money you need on hand to satisfy all of your daily transactions, okay? Or your weekly, monthly transactions, what have you, okay? It's just the amount of money you need to normally go about your business, okay? Precautionary demand. It's money you keep in case of an emergency, right? A flat tire, broken arm, things like that. You know, save it for a rainy day. Maybe you keep a little money on hand. I know I had a friend growing up who always kept, I think his parents kept something like $500 in a box stored away, right? Just in a corner, hidden, and that was precautionary demand, okay? Simply because that was money for a rainy day. If you lose everything, I guess, then you still have some money lying around, okay? Third, you have a speculative demand, okay? The speculative demand, you keep some cash on hand for an unexpected financial opportunity, okay? So maybe, and this doesn't really apply to most of the working class, but for some rich people, they keep money on hand. Or entrepreneurs keep money on hand. Why? Because they never know. Maybe a stock suddenly leaps in price, right? Well, if they have cash on hand, if they have money on hand to go and purchase that stock, then they can get in on some of the gains from it. Versus if you don't have any money on hand, then you won't be able to purchase the bond or the stock or whatever that potential opportunity would be, okay? There's one more thing we need to talk about, which is the slide's behind me and you can read it, but there's just, you can memorize it too, right? When interest rates go up, the prices of bonds go down, okay? Which it should say right here, inverse relation between bond prices and interest rates, okay? When interest rates go up, bond prices go down. When bond prices go up, interest rates go down, okay? There's an inverse relation between the two. We just needed to talk, and the intuition is on this purple slide, which you can look at, and feel free to email me if you don't understand it, but it's not the most important thing for this course, okay? All you really need to know in order to understand the Keynes effect is the transaction, precautionary, and speculative demand for money, and that when bond prices go up, interest rates go down, and vice versa, okay? So now let's talk about the Keynes effect. Same thing, Keynes effect starts off the same way as the Pigou effect, okay? When demand drops off, right? When aggregate supply is greater than aggregate demand, prices go down. When prices go down, the real value of your money increases. Okay? The real value of your dollar increases. You can buy more stuff, which means the amount of money you need to satisfy your transaction and precautionary demands go down, right? If the prices of water bottles went down, you don't need as much money to satisfy your transaction demand, okay? Well, if that happens, that leaves you with more money. The amount of money for speculative demand goes up, right? If I don't have to hold as much money to pay my bills, things like that on a daily basis, well, now I have more money for the stock market, okay? So the speculative demand can go up. That means my demand for securities goes up, right? I'm going to try to buy more stocks, more bonds, things like that, okay? So let's start from the beginning again. Aggregate supply greater than aggregate demand. Prices go down, which means the real value of our dollar increases, okay? When that happens, you don't need as much money on hand for the precautionary and the transaction demand for money. So since I don't need to hold as much to pay my bills on a daily basis, right, buy pizza, buy soda, things like that, well, now I have more money to put into the stock market. So I put more money into the stock market by buying more securities. If I buy more securities, that pushes up bond prices, right? My demand for securities goes up, which means bond prices go up. If bond prices go up, that inverse relation again, if bond prices go up, interest rates go down. And if interest rates go down, then investment goes up. It says right here, interest rates go down, consumption and investment goes up. As consumption and investment goes up, you get increasing income, which gets you back to full employment. Okay? So let's just do this one more time. You have a situation of full employment, right? It's Phillips curve, full employment, right? Mostly everyone has a job. There's a few who are unemployed. Okay? Well, you have full employment. Let's say something happens, right? Suddenly there's just some more unemployment. Okay? So demand drops off. That lowers prices. When prices are lowered, that increases the real value of money, which means the amount you need to satisfy transactions and precautionary goes down. Okay? The transaction and precautionary motives don't require as much money to satisfy them anymore, which means the amount left for your speculative demand goes up. So now that the amount you have for your speculative demand goes up, you buy more securities. When you buy securities, bond prices go up, which lowers interest rates. When interest rates go down, consumption and investment goes up. Then you have the multiplier. Consumption and investment go up with the multiplier, which causes causes income to rise, and eventually you get to full employment. Okay? So, those were the two real balance effects. You have the direct real balance effect and you have the indirect real balance effect. Ultimately, what that did, as I mentioned, okay, it caused the Keynesians, it allowed the textbook Keynesians to say that capitalism has a self-adjusting mechanism. Okay? So capitalism has a self-adjusting mechanism. So these Keynesians, right, the textbook Keynesians, say capitalism has a self-adjusting mechanism, which is very much like the neoclassicals. Right? The neoclassicals say capitalism has a self-adjusting mechanism. So these two groups now see eye to eye. They both have vertical supply curves. They both say that aggregate demand does not determine the level of output or employment, right? It's the Phillips curve that determines output and employment, okay? Third, they all say that capitalism has a self-adjusting mechanism, okay? So the Keynesians and the neoclassicals, or the textbook Keynesians and the neoclassicals, form the textbook Keynesian neoclassical synthesis, which dominates to this day, dominates the economic discipline to this day. Okay? Meanwhile, those three things are completely different from what Keynes said. Okay? Keynes said aggregate demand determines output and employment. Right? So Keynes said aggregate demand determines output and employment. Textbook Keynesian neoclassical synthesis says aggregate demand does not determine aggregate income or employment. Keynes said capitalism has no self-adjusting mechanism. The neoclassical Keynesian synthesis said capitalism does have a self-adjusting mechanism, which is the real balance effects we just went over. Third, Keynes said that the supply curve is basically horizontal, whereas the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis said it's vertical. Okay? The aggregate supply curve is vertical, And we arrived at that conclusion because of the Phillips curve. Okay? So those are three big differences between Keynes and the textbook Keynesian neoclassical synthesis. Okay? So despite the fact you had a lot of people running around saying, I'm Keynesian, I'm a Keynesian, things like that, right? They really were quite close to being a neoclassical. Okay? In fact, which I started off this lecture by arguing this, by stating this, they are far closer to being neoclassicals than they are to being Keynes, which is why you had the article Keynesian Economics versus the Economics of Keynes, right? Because what Axel Leyenhofen was trying to point out was these Keynesians who are involved in the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis are nothing like Keynes and are in fact very much like neoclassicals, okay? So that's lecture 5, right? This is week 5 materials down. We're done with week 5. I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera off now, and next time we'll pick up with week 6, okay, or lecture 6, which is going to talk about modern monetary theory. We're going to look at Keynes's followers, Keynes, post-Keynesians, and we're going to look at what his followers have been doing over the last 30 years or so, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera off now.